The Great War in 10 minutes, or World War I explained, for those of you who've been following for a while. You know that we have a series on this channel where we attempt to explain large topics in just 10 minutes. Now, we've explained how entire countries work, big complicated bureaucracies, the history of the universe, and more. But something we haven't done is explain a world war. So, today, let us see how well we can do with one of the most impactful wars in human history. World War I. Let's do this. Okay, so the first thing to understand about World War I is that it was not simply a European conflict. As you'll see in a minute, Europe was at the center of it. But there were also theaters of war that took place all over the world, including Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. So, to keep things simple, we're going to focus primarily on the European front, which had 4 major participants. On one side, you had Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, often called the Central Powers, and on the other side, you had France, Britain, Russia, Italy, Japan, and eventually the United States, often called the Triple Entente, or the Allies. Now, these alliances would grow and change throughout the course of the war, but the way they got into the war is fairly simple. It all started on June 28, 1914, when a Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in Sarajevo. Immediately after the assassination, the Austrians wanted to declare war on Serbia, and they got the support of their German allies in doing so. But before long, the Russians were mobilized to defend Serbia, which was not only an ally, but also ethnically and religiously tied to Russia. The French were also quick to jump into action, partially due to their own colonial ambitions, but mostly because they were tied to the Antwerp Cordial, a military alliance they had formed with the British. Not to mention the fact that it was widely believed that the Germans had designs on French territory. And finally, the Italians jumped in on the side of the Entente, after declaring the war on Austria-Hungary due to long-standing territorial disputes. And just like that, within a month, the major powers of Europe were at war. But unlike in other wars, such as the 7 Years' War that we explained in another video, this war wasn't primarily fought by professional soldiers. In fact, it was the first war where the vast majority of combatants were not only conscripts, but volunteers who often had no military experience whatsoever. And as you might imagine, this made for some pretty terrible generals. To understand the next few years of this war, it will help us to learn the names of just a couple more countries. First, there was Belgium, a small country sandwiched between Germany and France, which the Germans would quickly invade. Then, across the North Sea from Belgium, there was Britain, a constitutional monarchy which the Germans would not invade, perhaps because they knew the British Navy would stop them. And then, far to the east, there was Serbia, which, as we said earlier, was at the center of the conflict from the beginning. So, back to the war. One of the first battles that we should talk about is the Battle of the Marne. This battle would take place in September of 1914 and would be one of the first major engagements between the French and the Germans. If the Germans were able to successfully flank the French and take the capital of Paris, then the war would likely be over before it even began. But luckily for the French, their transportation system was better developed, which allowed them to quickly move troops to the front. They would hold off the Germans and eventually force them to retreat. This would end up being one of the few decisive battles of the war and would result in the Western Front becoming a stalemate. What do we mean by that? Well, after the Battle of the Marne, the fighting in Europe would primarily take place in the trenches along the Western Front, which stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland. There were several reasons why neither side could make much progress. First, new technologies such as machine guns, poison gas in tanks had led to massive casualties. And second, the navies of the British Empire and the Germans were so evenly matched that neither could invade or transport troops without risking their own destruction. But the stalemate had an effect on morale, especially among the British public. To get out of the trench warfare of the Western Front, many British leaders and citizens began to look elsewhere, and nowhere else looked more promising than the Middle East, under British control. Egypt had become an important hub of trade between Europe and Asia, and with the Ottoman Empire still hanging on to Palestine and Mesopotamia, the British were concerned that the Central Powers may cut off access to these valuable trade routes. So, in 1915, the British began planning an attack on the Ottomans. The plan was to take control of the Suez Canal and then send General Edmund Allenby and his Egyptian Expeditionary Force into Palestine and capture Jerusalem. Meanwhile, another British general, Arthur Sir Stanley Maude, would take his troops north to capture Baghdad and the rest of Mesopotamia. Exactly what would happen. By the end of 1917, both Jerusalem and Baghdad would fall, and the British would advance all the way to the outskirts of Damascus. But perhaps even more importantly, the Russian Empire would collapse in the east. At the beginning of the war, the Russians had joined in to defend Serbia. But after suffering devastating losses against the Austrians and the Germans, the people of Russia began to lose faith in their government. When the Germans invaded East Prussia and began executing captured Russian soldiers, outrage began to boil over, and the Russian Revolution would soon follow. In October of 1917, Vladimir Lenin would lead the Bolsheviks to power and begin withdrawing Russian forces from the war. This would be a huge blow to the Allies, since Russia was one of their largest and most powerful militaries. But there was still plenty of fighting left. For example, there was still the Italian front, which remained largely unchanged throughout the entirety of the war, as well as the American front, which had just opened up. Prior to 1917, the Americans had remained neutral throughout the war. But there were two major factors that would cause them to join the conflict. First, there was the issue of sinking. In 1915, the Germans had begun unrestricted submarine warfare, which meant that any ship that entered the Atlantic was liable to be sunk by the Germans, regardless of whether or not they were carrying military cargo. This practice would result in the sinking of 3 U.S. merchant ships. Second, there was the issue of propaganda. Throughout the war, the British had been feeding information to the American press that portrayed the Germans as a brutal and barbaric enemy. But the issue that would ultimately push the Americans into the war was the Zimmerman telegram, a secret message sent by the Germans to the Mexicans proposing a military alliance. When this telegram was leaked to the press, it caused an uproar across America. Soon after, the U.S. would declare war on the Central Powers and send 186,000 troops to Europe under the command of General John J. Pershing. These American troops would play an important role in helping the Allies win the war, although perhaps not in the way you would expect. See? When the Americans arrived, the Western Front had again become a stalemate, largely due to the amount of casualties each side was taking. And this is where the concept of wearing down your enemy comes in, since the resources of the Central Powers were limited. The Allies decided to bombard the Germans non-stop until they exhausted their ability to replenish their forces. And sure enough, after a year of fighting, the Germans finally began to buckle. By the end of 1918, they would sign an armistice with the Allies, and peace talks would soon begin. In the end, the fighting would come to a close on June 28th, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The peace treaty would strip away nearly all of the Central Powers' land and blame Germany for the entire war. But that's a topic for another video. And now that you've learned about World War I, you can watch our video about World War II right here, or click this other video instead. Click to subscribe if you haven't already, and click to watch more of our videos. And as always, thank you for watching.